Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Always Believer over here with me, Arianna Davis, as always, with Team Flyer. Today we have a beautiful, wonderful, fantastic soul of a guest. I'm super excited to have her on. I appreciate her art and her words and her message. So without further ado, Arianna Davis. Hi, Arianna.
Yeah, what a welcome. Thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to be here today.
I'm super excited to be able to continue spreading your message and your words and just everything else about you. We do have an interview with you on the Latina podcast, which I absolutely adore. And since then, we've just been DMing back and forth because you're so friendly and so appreciative and lovely person. So,
No, listen, you've been such a big supporter of all of my work, but especially what would Frida do. So I am like, I love talking about the book, but also all the things. And also just meeting people on social media and you included, and I loved our last conversation on the podcast. So I'm excited to be back today.
hey, thank you. So, yeah, we're definitely talking a little bit about everything, of course, apart from an amazing book. But before we do start, let's tell the audience a little bit about yourself. So, where you're from and like what are you doing, obviously, so they know.
Yeah, so well, I'm originally from Baltimore, but I've lived in New York for 12 years now, which, according to Carrie Bradshaw, makes me officially a New Yorker. And my background is so my dad is Black, he's African American, and my mom is Puerto Rican. I grew up like the biracial kid in the suburbs of Maryland, where there's not a lot of Latinos, and there's definitely not a lot of like mixed Latinos. So growing up, I definitely was kind of always the other kid. That's like, a big part of my story that I always like to share. But then as a grown up, I eventually moved to New York, and that's where New York, like, everybody is a mix of something, and it's a melting pot, and it was a whole different experience, and a big part of the reason why I love the city so much. So yeah, I'm in New York now, and by day I'm the senior director of editorial and strategy for Oprah Daily, which is formerly known as Oprah Magazine. We relaunched as Oprah Daily in March. And yeah, so basically I oversee all things digital for Oprah's brand. So that includes the website and social, video, all that good stuff. And then I also published my first book last October, What Would Frida Do? A Guide to Living Boldly, inspired by the life of the one and only iconic Frida Kahlo. So that's the very short, quick version of who I am and my story.
Which is outstanding and incredible, and just it gives us so much hope and light for all the Latinx out there and the Afro Latinas out there, just like to see you shine. And not only, of course, work with Oprah, which is pretty impressive, but just being an author and like sharing part of your story as well. Oh my God, I love it. That's actually one of the things that I definitely wanted to talk to you about, of course. Your background, being biracial. Walk us through that a little bit more about like how you felt about growing up and like loving yourself, and how did you fall in love with yourself, better said.
I definitely think it's been a journey. I would say it probably wasn't until my 20s when I was living in New York. I think a big part of learning to love myself was working for Oprah Magazine, where the motto is like living your best life, and working for a woman, Oprah Winfrey, who is all about leaning into who you are and living your most authentic life, and living your life as authentically to you as possible. I think that working for the magazine in my early 20s, all that started to kind of seep in, and I got to a point where I realized like I was just more comfortable in my own skin. And I think that a lot of that had to do with growing up, that job, also just like being in New York and not feeling as other as I had my whole, time growing up. But I definitely, my mom is Puerto Rican, but she's white Puerto Rican, like white with blonde hair. My dad is Black, and they had, when they first got married before I was even born, to put it in perspective, my mom's family didn't go to their wedding because my dad was Black. And, there's a lot of kind of like family stuff there. And then knowing that history, and then growing up in the suburbs of Maryland where, no one looked like me. I went to a mostly white school. So it was like being any kind of brown was like, you were going to be other, and you were not necessarily going to fit in. But then, the few Black friends that I did have, they would make jokes like, oh, you're Mexican, right? And then, my, few Latin friends or family would like tease me about, my not great Spanish, or, my hair. And it was definitely that feeling. Anyone who probably ever had on the podcast who's talked about, either being mixed or being, from different cultures, there's always that feeling of not feeling like you belong, and of having like kind of feeling like you're one foot in one culture, one foot in the other. So I think that's a struggle that I always had growing up. It's something that's still, even to this day, I'm 33 years old, and it's still something that at times I deal with, just even um, with dating or friendships, or I had a huge falling out with one of my closest friends since college a few years ago over race, and it was something that I never would have thought happened. But I think that these are conversations that we still need to be having. There's definitely conversations that, even though yes, there's more acceptance now, and I think that we're having a lot of these conversations more often. You can't have them enough, and I think that unless you have really ever experienced being other, I think most people have been other in some way or another, but I think unless you really know what that's like and have felt like what that feels like to carry it with you for your whole life, it can be hard for some people to understand.
I definitely, definitely, definitely agree completely. Um, just being like, because I've also mixed culture, of course. I was born in Venezuela, but my dad's Ecuadorian. And then I grew up a little bit in the States, and then I moved to Spain. you know, Luckily enough, thankfully, I was bilingual, which is, just because you're Latin doesn't mean that you're bilingual. And that should totally be a thing as well. That should be accepted, for example. And just talking about this more and more, I do feel that it's coming more and more to light, and that's really positive. And that's another reason why, of course, with you, like, with your backstory, we're definitely going to be talking about it. Not only because I do have a lot of Afro Latinos listeners and like Latino listeners, of course, and community, but also a lot of people who aren't. And it's like a little bit of an eye opener finally to be like, oh, okay, let me see what you're about, and let me see what you went through, so I can see like how can we collaborate together, because yeah. Um so growing up, of course, with Baltimore and whatnot, what was your Latinx, Afro Latinx um, inspiration, or people you admired when you were growing up? Any singers or actors that you can think of?
Yeah, I mean, I was a huge J Lo fan. I, so being like growing up in Maryland, obviously there was like the older school artists like that my mom listened to, like Celia Cruz and Mark Anthony, and like those are Hector Lavoe, like all of the like old school artists that we listened to in the house, and that I was a big fan of just because of like the music that my mom listened to. And like for me, I think music and food were like the two big ways that it did connect to both cultures, because we grew up in Maryland, near my dad's family, which was my Black side. And so on a more regular basis, I was seeing my Black grandparents. And so I feel that culturally, and especially because I was in Maryland, in an area where there weren't a lot of Latinos and there definitely weren't a lot of Puerto Ricans, I was more, I think, in touch with the Black side, unless it was like we were going to New York to visit my grandparents who were in the Bronx. And so I think that for me, I really connected the most with like my Latin side through music. And I listened to a lot of old school salsa, but then like, as a teenager, that was like really like the very beginnings of like the reggaeton boom. So like Daddy Yankee, and but even at that time it was like Nina Sky, and like there was a lot, there's kind of like this rise in like the like quote unquote urban reggaeton music. So I definitely had a big moment there. But J Lo was like everything for me, because it was like she was just like the biggest star that there was, and she was Puerto Rican, and she was amazing, and she was singing in Spanish and English. And I just really looked up to her in so many ways as like this like very powerful, ambitious Latina that was also like starring in all these movies. And so I think for me, J Lo was a big one. I also we listened to a lot of Gloria Estefan, because she was also very big in the 80s and my mom loved her. Selena, obviously, I was a huge Selena fan. I remember I knew some Selena music, but it wasn't until she died that it was like, I feel like when she died and her name was all over the news, that it was like, wait, wasn't she like that beautiful young? And like that was when my like interest in her really started. And then of course when the movie came out starring J-Lo, that was when it was like, obsession. So yeah, J-Lo, Selena, Gloria Estefan, and also just kind of like the reggaeton movement, which is like funnily enough now kind of like having a big full circle moment in like mainstream pop culture, I feel like.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because we're the same age, and I definitely grew up with something very, very similar, and including, Daddy Yankee, and like the first
Yeah.
times you actually hear those kind of music. I mean, those kind of songs, sorry. And I was like, oh, look at him now. Like, look, kind of the full circles. That's kind of all that, mainstream is listening to right now,
Exactly.
one way or another.
Right. Yeah. Even on like I was on like a regular like mainstream Spotify playlist earlier, and they were just playing Weezen and Yandel, and I was like, oh, okay, I guess we're like Weezen and Yandel are now like pop So it's been really cool though, I think, to see that and to see that kind of progression in music and to see that, like, I feel like when we were growing up in that era, there was like the Latin boom of like Ricky Martin and J Lo and
Yeah,
Shakira,
Shakira as well, who did the
you
crossover as well from Spanish to English.
exactly. And so that was like what, like probably like late 90s, early 2000s. But now it's like to see that a lot of these artists I think are finally getting their due in the mainstream is again long overdue, but it's great to see it.
Definitely. Do you, I was going to actually, before I ask you the next one, is New York one of the reasons that you moved? I mean, is Jennifer Lopez one of the reasons you moved to New York? Because she's from the Bronx?
Probably, to be honest, subconsciously maybe, but I think I always was drawn to New York ever since I was a kid. I think because I loved my Latin family so much. I love the Puerto Rican side, and it was like trips to go to visit my grandmother and my grandfather in the Bronx were always like this like magical, place that we would only go for holidays. So I always loved New York. I loved, my mom would always, I think, get a little nostalgic. So on the drive up, like as soon as we got to Jersey, she would start blasting salsa, and it was like she was coming home, and we're in New York, and it felt very much like a second home for me. But I also, since I was young age, knew I wanted to be a writer. I've always, since I was literally 8, I was a shy kid. I think a big way of me coping with being quote unquote other was kind of getting lost in books. I used to read a lot, and then that led to me writing a lot. And so from a young age, I always knew I wanted to be a writer. And eventually, I was like, okay, well, I don't know if I can just like write books for a living. So like, job wise, I thought about being a journalist. And so that being said, I think I always knew, just like even work wise, New York is the place to be if you're a writer or a journalist. And so I think I was always pretty set on moving to New York at some point or another as an adult. But I don't think I really knew for sure. And, that I don't know. I think I just fell in love with the city at a young age and just always knew that I would end up here. But now it's like I'm kind of like, a lifer for right now anyway.
At least for now, but you do adore the city because you're always posting it through your Instagram stories or your feed itself, and it's so beautiful what you post. And like even those moments of peace that you post, it's like, New York is really busy, of course, but you find those like hidden locations, and I'm like, oh, that's so nice. And you're like by the water, and you find the peace among the chaos.
I definitely try because again, like obviously New York can be like super, it can be stressful and it is an overwhelming city, but that's to me one of the things that's most inspiring about it. And there's definitely even in the pandemic, like there's just a certain energy to New York that I feel is like nowhere else in the world.
Oh, that's lovely. I've visited quite a few times. I miss it. I can't wait to go back when things are a bit safer, even though, I'm fully vaccinated, thankfully, but still. It's definitely a city that I guess you either love it or hate it, and I definitely love it, if that makes sense, you know what I mean?
Totally.
Um, going back to a little bit of your childhood, because I did read somewhere that you and me also have something else in common. Because we both love to write, we both love to read. We grew up we're the same age. The Babysitters Club.
Yes. Oh my gosh. The Babysitters Club, a favorite. Yes. Tell me everything.
I adore the fact that you read them, of course, I also did. I recently, actually, like last week when the time of recording this, but still, um, I watched the movie because my husband gave me the movie because he knows that like I loved it when I was growing up. I haven't seen it in like since I was a kid, basically, but I remember everything. And I'm like, oh my God. And then we watched the Netflix show together as well, which they did an incredible job. Have you watched it?
I loved the Netflix show. I was a little skeptical because because I was such a big fan of the books and I did watch the movie back in the day. I loved the original movie, so I was skeptical about how I would feel about the show. But I thought they did such a good job, like considering like I'm way grown, like beyond the years. Um, I thought they did a really good job of kind of bringing it into like the modern age and just like with the cast and making it look a little bit more diverse. Like I thought it was super cute, and I'm like, I saw that they just finished filming the second season, so I'm super excited to see that.
Super excited. I feel like they did it. I understand you completely because I was like, am I gonna like this? Am I not gonna like? 'Cause the movie was great. The movie, like hands down, even after watching after so many years, I'm like, oh my God, like it still lives on such like in a kind, dear way. And then when we watched the Netflix show, the diversity, the cast itself, the really good actresses, of course, the fact that they have like different cultures, but they explain to you those different cultures. They talked about like transgender, they talk about just social issues and stances. And I'm like, wow, like this is a show that even if you're an adult, like it's so powerful to see. And the fact that you, of course, if you grew up with it and you love to read and you love to write, that they did a really good job. So I was like, more people need to watch the show, even if you're an adult, because it gets to you.
Yeah, it's. I mean, even if you didn't read the original books, I feel like it's just like a fun, cute, light-hearted show to watch. Which, like, I think now, after everything that we've been through in the past year, like everyone could use a show like that. So I definitely would highly recommend. But it has a definitely there's a lot of nostalgia there for me, having read the books, and like then now we're trying. It's been a very long time. So as I was watching it, I was like, oh my gosh, I forgot about this character, or like, oh, I can't believe they cast this person as this character. So it
Same
was
goes.
fun. Yeah, it was super cute.
I haven't like I don't remember the books that well. We did go to we go to the bookstore often because we love reading, both of us, a whole lot. And then we actually went to the kids section and we saw all the books, and that's how the conversation started. And I'm like, she's like, "Do you remember these?" I'm like, "I remember reading them. I just don't remember like everything that happened, of course." And I'm like, that would be like a fun read because I mean, I read a lot of things like your book, of course, which is very motivational. I read a lot of business books, like kind of heavy topic as well. And I'm like, this would be something fun, like to read,
Yeah,
like have that inner spark, you know?
for sure. We definitely all could use that escape right now.
Oh, yes, without a doubt. So, going from all the way to your childhood to now, of course, right before we dive into your book, um, because you work for Oprah, of course, and Oprah Daily, you've interviewed so many delightful, amazing souls right now in the world, like Hillary Clinton, of course, Oprah, Will Smith, John Legend. What has been your biggest takeaway from all that? Like, how do you feel being able to like give them a voice as well, being part of their journey?
I mean, that's really interesting when you think about it like that. I mean, I think that like all it's been a really incredible ride. I think the biggest thing that I have learned is I think that like a lot of people have asked me like, oh, do you get nervous or who are you most nervous for? And like, don't get me wrong, I definitely was nervous for, especially I think Hillary Clinton, because I think I was actually, this was when I was at Refinery 29, and it was one of the first interviews that she had done after losing the election and with the release of her new book. So it was kind of like a really big deal in capital letters. And then, I've interviewed Oprah, which like Oprah is Oprah. She's like the queen of journalism and the queen of, interviewing and kind of obviously in addition to being my boss, but also like inspiration as far as a journalist. So a lot of those interviews I've definitely been nervous for, but I think the thing that I've realized the most is at the end of the day, we all have so much more in common than we think, and like we're all human, and even celebrities like are people too. And I think a lot of I try to look at those conversations as just that, conversations, and not like hype it up in my brain to be like these huge big interviews, because at the end of the day it's like they're all just people, and they're all just people who want to share their stories and tell their stories. And so I try to just think of them as conversations with interesting people, and I try to think about what are the questions that other people who are watching this would want to ask, or would want the answers to. And I try my best to think about it as just like conversations with really interesting people that I get to share with the world, which is like sometimes really crazy that that's like a part of my job, and that's what I get to do for a living, because I love to talk. So it's like that's literally just like basically what I get paid to do. That's pretty amazing. So yeah, it's definitely an incredible thing, and I think that for me the most interesting part of it is that it's like even though a lot of these are names that we all know, and they sound really impressive, and they sound really obviously like celebrities, at the end of the day like they're people too.
I love that I love that that's actually your biggest takeaway, that there's just people.
Yeah.
Because I always must admit, whoever if I'm talking to, always believer, like Team Flyer over here, to just friends in general, like of course I get nervous, even talking to you, because for me in my head it's like, oh my God, you're a published author, you're doing so many things to change the world and make it a better place. Of course you work for Oprah, like all these sorts of things. And then you're like, breathe, take it back a bit, because you're a human too. And vice versa. So like I like the fact that even with you.
Like, please don't be nervous talking to me. It's just like I'm just like we're all the same. Even like a John Legend, a Will Smith, like obviously we build it up in our heads. Like for me, I grew up on Fresh Prince.
Fresh Prince, of
Favorite.
course.
Like I feel like I can. My sister and I can recite like every line of Fresh Prince ever said.
We are
So,
currently rewatching it, my husband and me, right now. Like we
yeah,
haven't seen it since we were kids, basically. And it's on HBO, and we're like, this is something, and it's like the best thing ever.
right. Yeah. So it's like something like that. It is a big deal that you're like, okay, wow, like this is a bit. It's a big deal. Like it's Will Smith. But even afterwards, it's kind of like, he's a person and I'm a person, and it's two people in a conversation. He's just happens to be a little bit more well known, but yeah, I try to keep that in mind no matter who I'm talking to.
I love that as well. And I feel like there's some sense of calmness when you talk to people as well because you just treat them like people. And like, I get this a lot, especially like with Zoom calls that we're so used to Zoom meetings and recordings and things like that. It's like, well, if you have like a background issue or if you have a sound issue or, you got to step out for a quick second, it's like, well, we're people too, because it could happen both ways.
Or if
You
you have a
know,
dog who's
or
like,
you have like right now I'm seeing your little dog right now on your lap, for example. I recorded with a mom the other day and she has a 2 year 2 3 she's either 2 or 3 years old, and she didn't want to leave her mom's lap the whole time, so she was there. She was quiet the whole time. So like no one knows. But it's like
people might not even realize, but yep, here we are. Just my I mean, and Leo is, for anyone who's listening can't see, Leo is my pandemic puppy, and he is very needy and just like, um, it's I never would have, even if you had told me over a year ago that I would even have a puppy or a dog, I would have been like, what? So it's like the fact that I now have a dog and then he's also like attached at the hip and I'm also attached to the hip to him. It's just like, it's crazy.
I love it as well. Actually, that was one of the questions later on in the interview. Like, oh, if you gonna talk about your dog, because I'm a huge animal lover as well. I mean, like they hear about Binks, my cat, all the time. So it's just they're adorable, and they we need them so much as they need us. So they're really good help for, especially after the year that we've all gone through.
100%.
It's my goodness, because I got him in May last year. So yeah,
And the kitty.
exactly, without a doubt. So all right. Now we're definitely going to dive into your book, of course. What would Frida do? So the first question, I know it's the most stereotypical, but where did your love for Frida start?
Yeah, my love of Frida. I think for me, Frida was definitely, growing up Latina, my mom being Puerto Rican, and just like, having a lot of strong Latino women in my life. Frida was, she was just someone, like, I remember seeing her paintings like hung up in some friends' houses, and just being aware of that she's kind of like one of our icons in our history, but I didn't really totally know her full story. I think I learned a little bit about her art in school, but it really wasn't until I was in high school and I watched the movie Frida, with Salma Hayek, and I think I like rented it from Blockbuster. If anyone can remember the Blockbuster days, if everyone is listening to this is old enough.
I'm pretty sure that you remember Blockbuster.
Yeah, so I remember watching the movie, and this was, it went on to be Oscar nominated, and Selma Hayek did an incredible job as Frida. And the movie is a lot about Frida and Diego and their love story. But for me, I was just so struck by Frida's story, and it was just like, I recognized a lot of her art and some of her story, but it was like seeing all the obstacles that she went through. She was in a terrible Charlie accident at 18 that basically led her to have a lifetime of disabilities and surgeries. She wasn't able to have children. She did have a really roller coaster marriage with her husband Diego. So many things that she went through in life, and yet she still went on to become this iconic person who is still on a first name basis for most of us, and whose art lives on, especially now in the social media era. So I think for me, that was what really sparked the obsession. It was like that movie, and just really then from there, like, I would go down like Google black holes, and anytime there was like exhibits in New York or anywhere I was, that were about Frida, I made sure to go visit them. And when I would travel to Mexico often, I visited La Casa Azul, and anytime I would travel or friends would get me gifts, it was, I kind of just became known as like the girl obsessed with Frida. So yeah, that was
Hence
really
the
what
book.
yeah, that's what really, and is what kicked it all off.
I adore that you were able to take something so already meaningful and give it even more meaning. Because talking about that, what was your biggest lesson from Frida, or what has been, or what is just in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the lessons that came from Frida for me definitely were while writing the book. The way that the book came about kind of happened, it was a little bit backwards, in that actually a publisher, um, actually, like right around the time that I came back to Hearst, I was working at Refinery 29 at the time, and then I came back to Hearst Magazines, which owns Oprah. It was Oprah Magazine at the time, And someone from Hachette Books had been following my work at Refinery and following that I wrote a lot for Black and Latino women, and had also heard through the grapevine that I was a really big Frida fan. And so basically, they approached me to ask if I had any interest in writing a book about Frida. And at the time, I was definitely a little bit, I think, intimidated by the ask. I was like, it's Frida Kahlo. There's been so much written about her. There's a huge biography that was written in 1983 by Hayden Herrera that's like known as kind of like the gold standard Frida biography. There's been a movie with some, like, there's been so much that's done that I kind of was like, I definitely am interested, but like, what would I contribute to this that's different than what's already been done? And there's also so much Frida stuff out there. There's just the Frida t-shirts and bags, and like I write about this in the book a lot. So I think for me, the question was like, do I feel like I have something to contribute to the conversation or to contribute to the like remembrance of Frida's legacy? And the thing that I did land on was like, I am someone who's learned a lot of lessons from Frida. And the reason that I am so obsessed with her and I've been so fascinated by her life is because I feel like there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the way she lived so boldly and the way that she lived life to the fullest. She was such a proponent of Viva la Vida, and all of that kind of made me think, what if I were to write it from the perspective of like sharing the lessons that I've learned as someone who loves Frida, whether you're someone who's loved Frida for many years like I have, or you have no idea who she is and you're just looking for a little inspiration for your own life. So that was kind of how the book came about. And then I think while writing the book and really thinking about, okay, why am I so fascinated with this woman? What is it about her? What are the lessons that I've learned? I obviously had to do a ton of research. And it was while doing that research, just like really taking note of the things that, like, as someone who's been through heartbreak, as someone who's been through, mental health challenges, as someone who's had ups and downs in their career, like all of those things are things we can all relate to. So I was looking at Frida's life and just thinking about, what can we learn from her? So that's a long way to say there's a lot of lessons that I think, that I've learned, and they're all in the book. Every chapter is on a different subject, and every chapter is kind of summarized by different lessons that I've learned. But I definitely think that the biggest lesson is Viva la Vida, and this idea of just like living your life to the fullest, because, Frida was able to, despite having so many miscarriages and so many surgeries and spending half of her lifetime in bed recuperating from illnesses and having a philandering husband who cheated on her with her sister, and like all of these horrible obstacles that she went through, that was still the message that she wrote in her final painting in her life, and that was still the energy that she embodied as a woman and as a person before she died. And so I'm like, if Frida can still live life to the fullest and do her best to make the most out of life despite, the negatives and the obstacles that she goes through, then, I can make it through a little pandemic. So that's kind of like what the way that I try to look at it. And I have thought a lot about Frida during this past year, and just literally the question of like, what would Frida do?
That is one heck of a summary, without a doubt. One heck of an answer, without a doubt. I feel like literally your book, every single chapter, much like you said, hits a different topic, and you can somehow relate no matter what. Obviously, your audience must be young women, probably Afro Latinas, Latinx in general, of course. I love the fact that every time I find your book, and you know this for a fact, that I do what I can with your book to like show it off, to always tag you, to be like, oh my God, go get this book, blah, blah, blah. And it's in the self motivational aisles usually. And I love that because the range of that is so big. Like your public is so much bigger in that aisle. So much like you said, someone who doesn't know anything about her, which could be the case, obviously so. But like, oh, let's find out. Plus, of course, the cover of your book is so like bright and bubbly that it attracts your attention with that yellow.
For sure. Yeah.
It's the easiest way to find your book. Just find the yellow, basically.
Yeah, the yellow definitely cannot be missed.
Exactly. I adore it. Um, how did you confront, or how did you manage? Because as a Latinx myself, and the reason why we have a Latina podcast, of course, with my fellow friend and coworker and just business partner in general, Anastasia, who's also Afro Latina, we talk a lot about, what's swept under the rug. And I do as much as I can over here. They always believe we should do more of the same. And in the Latinx culture, I've had a lot of Latinx come on and we're like, how do you deal with the fact that you're talking about something so that's still so taboo, like loss, like grief and sexuality, and being a lesbian or being bisexual and so on and so forth, you know? Like, how do you deal with all that kind of side of it?
Um, I mean, I think that that's definitely another lesson, I guess, to say that I learned from Frida, and that I think that it's like we just have to talk about it. Like we just have to put that story out there. I think one thing one comparison I made a lot last year when I was thinking about this was, Chrissy Teigen. There was so much conversation about her when she was open about her miscarriage and showing photos of the miscarriage and talking about it openly. Same with Meghan Markle. And it was almost like, wow, these women are like actually talking about their miscarriages in 2021. And then thinking back to Frida back in the 1930s, painting her miscarriage very vividly, and painting the pain that she went through and showing the fetus leaving her body, and thinking about how far ahead of her time Frida was, and how much of a storyteller she was for women, for the things that we normally don't like to talk about even now, all these years later. She was painting and telling her story about heartache and depression and pain and miscarriages and her struggles with not being able to be a mother. I mean, all the grief, all of those things that we're talking about now, the fact that Frida had the courage and the bravery at that time, it really inspires me. And I think that now, especially with social media, I try my best to not be the kind of person on social media and through my work that I don't like, which is that I see a lot of times people are just only showing the good parts, and they're only showing the good days, and they're only showing the, like, the fun things. And I have an amazing job, and I have, and I wrote a book, and those are both amazing things. And I could choose to only talk about those things, but I'm doing all of that while, like, living alone in a pandemic in New York City, which was like at one point was really like the center of the coronavirus pandemic, and dealing with like the loneliness and the grief and the sadness, and all those things are things that aren't easy. And I think that especially for women of color, I identify as both a Black woman, and I also identify as being Latina, and both cultures are not necessarily always the most embracing of talking about mental health or talking about the hard things to go through. So I find that, with my friends, but also even publicly, even when it can be hard, and I feel like it invites a lot of questions of like, wait, hold on, what's going on? And, there's that fear of like gossip, or that people are going to be wondering, if is there more to the story and what's really going on? And you also have to hold some things back. You can't, I don't want to give everything on social media. I want to still have some semblance of privacy. And even when it comes to my writing and to my work, I don't want to necessarily put all of my business out there. But at the same time, I recognize that if you do have a platform, whether it's a podcast or it's a story on a website or it's, you're an Instagram account, I think that if you do have a platform and a voice, it's important for us to encourage those conversations, and to, I think that people feel more comfortable sharing their own story if they see someone else doing the same, because they feel more comfortable. So I think that it can be hard, but I think that we do need to look to, or for inspiration, we can look to people who have done it before us, like the Fridas of the world, who, again, like if Frida could do that, like, in the 1920s and 30s, she could tell her stories of grief and heartache and pain and all of those things. Maybe we can find the strength to do the same.
Exactly, especially 100 years later. Literally. It's
Totally.
2021, you know?
Right.
It is incredible the fact that I feel like at least on my feed, but at the end of the day, you follow who you want to follow. Everyone I follow for the most part is, of course, very natural. And also, we do talk a lot about grief and like postpartum depression or miscarriages or, mental health in other ways, shapes, and form, or, being Afro Latina, what that means, or, eating disorders or things like that. And I really appreciate people doing that. And I do that as much as I can as well, because much like yourself, yeah, of course, there's things that I want to maintain private because I still have a private life. But, I share most of me as much as I can, much like you were saying earlier on in the beginning of this conversation when you talked about Oprah, being your authentic self.
Yeah.
Because the more we do talk about it, the better. I mean, that's one of the main reasons I started my blog. I started writing. Much like you, I started writing when I was probably 7, 8 years old, because I come from an abusive home. I had a really rocky teenagehood, and like, where did I escape to? My writing and reading, of course, but definitely writing. And through that, well, here I am, of course, being able to talk to people like you and spreading that message and that cause of just like, it's hard, but speak up, because that's the best. That's like the first step. And like, And also, like, what I always tell people, it's like follow feed, like follow like on your feed, because we consume it so much, things that motivate you. People like you, or people that you aspire to be, because they share their story as well.
Yeah,
And you
100.
do.
Yeah, especially because I think, we spend so much time on social media, like it or not. We can preach to the choir as much as we want about like, don't get on social media so much. But at the end of the day, especially again, like obviously the world is starting to finally open back up again. But I think many of us are still working remotely and still spending a lot of our time at home. And so when you're, home so much, or, you inevitably, no matter what, is happening in the world, social media is just a part of our lives right now. And I think that, we're all spending a lot of time on social media. And I think we have to just acknowledge that and accept it. Like, I definitely encourage social media detoxes. I try my best to do it every so often. I try my best to not be on social media right before bed, because I feel like I need that like time to just decompress and just not be like literally scrolling on Instagram to my eyes closed. But the reality is we are on social media. So I love your point about just, if you are, you are most likely going to be on social media so much, you might as well try to follow accounts that are going to lift you up and actually make you feel good, and not make you feel bad about yourself or make you feel anything other than good.
Yeah, because more and more there's more accounts that are people just living their best authentic life, and people who are talking about this, much like of course Frida did way back in the day. So that's something to really appreciate, because the world needs it more than ever. And you're right. We not only as just a person in general in this world consume a lot of social media, and even though we try to avoid it's there, I usually do like weekends away, and after a certain time of day, like I'm out, I'm done, like I don't want to be there. But much like you, it is my job as well. So it's kind of like okay,
Right. Yeah.
I love you all, but
Yeah, no, it's hard when you work in an industry, especially that like
yeah.
where you have to always be on, or it's like part of your work. But at the end of the day, I think we all should definitely find ways to just like get a little bit of a break, even if it's just for a few hours, because I do think that it's constant and we're constantly plugged in. And that's something that like, the Fridas of the world didn't have to deal with. Like she wasn't, in the Instagram era. So it's it's interesting when you think about it. But I think that we just have to try to do the best that we can, to try to just finds the little pockets of peace that we can, whether it's on Twitter or Instagram. I try to follow a lot of accounts that have like inspiring quotes that like, as I'm scrolling, I'm like, oh wow, this like really changed my perspective, or this person posts really positive things. So in addition to like the celebrity news and like the depressing news about the pandemic or whatever's happening in the world, um, that it's also just general like uplifting positive people and content.
Completely and utterly. And people, you better start following Arianna Davis, because you also have a lot of like truth in what you say, and a lot of positivity. And oh, I love your feed. I love what you post, because it comes straight from the heart.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Of course, my love. So living boldly, of course, is a huge task. One that seems very difficult sometimes. How do you check in on yourself to make sure that you are living boldly?
Oh, what a good question.
Thank you.
I mean, I think that listen, like especially this past year, I think the idea of living boldly is definitely not always easy. I think that there's some I had to get to a point during the pandemic where I was like, maybe living boldly can also just mean like just doing the best that I can to like, stay positive every day. Like I think that there's this idea that living boldly has to mean that like, you're getting on a plane and traveling every day, or that you're like, always telling people off at work, or that you're like always speaking up. And like I think that there's a lot of that in the book, and in Frida, and the fact that like, she was very unapologetic. She said what was on her mind. She um loved who she loved without, thinking about what other people had to say. But I think that there are definitely those lessons that I've learned, like when it comes to my romantic relationships, or just trying to speak up more in work situations or with my family, because I'm typically not a very confrontational person. So there are times where I literally have to be like, okay, what would Frida do? Like, you can be more bold. Like you can, what's the worst that can happen if you were to speak up for yourself right now, or stand up for yourself? And that's definitely something that I've had to work a lot on in the past, not just the past year, but just like, for a long time, I think. And I think also, I think that there are small lessons in the book that have really stuck with me. Like I actually just posted this past weekend. One of my favorites um, from the book is, Frida, she was very big into like the details. So she loved to like, she would like painstakingly like, set the table for dinner every night and like make it look like a piece of art with like the perfect flowers, and just like setting you know, like matching plate sets together, and like a really beautiful tablecloth that she found at the flea market. And it was like everything in her life was almost like a work of art. She decorated her home with like small details, her outfits every day, the way that she did her hair. Like there is like those small details were also ways that she lived boldly, because it just was a reminder that we only get one life, so you might as well live it to the fullest, even if it's the small things. So those are things that on my more down days during the pandemic, where it's been like, it's been a tough time, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna buy some twinkly lights, and I'm gonna fill my apartment with candles, and I'm gonna like make sure that I do a bubble bath every couple days. Like there are small things that I've done that I feel are me living boldly, because it's like I'm just making the best of my circumstances and making sure that I prioritize self-care. Then I'm also just doing little things that make me feel good on a day-to-day basis.
I love everything that you said because it comes back to, like you said at the beginning, traveling every day, which also, like, pre-COVID, of course, we were able to do more often and live that kind of bold life and be able to go from here to there and whatnot, all the way down to during the pandemic, but even after the pandemic, make sure that all those small things make you happy, and like make sure that you live your life boldly through those small actions, because at the end of the day, those small actions are going to turn into big actions little by little. And whereas you have the candles, I for like everyone knows I'm a huge Disney fan. I have my stuffed animals, I might be 33 as well, but like those things make me happy around the house.
Right.
Because they do, apart from like having flowers and like the bubble bath, of course, when we can, and things like that. So it doesn't matter what range it is, but it is a way of living boldly. And I think I've reflected on that as well during the pandemic, of like the clothes I wear, like how do they make me feel? Did I really just get more like, because we've been in leggings and a t-shirt all day, except like when we record or we have to do something via Zoom, we're kind of, dress up a little bit more. But other than that, obviously it's just really, really comfortable because we've been home, which is great. But I'm like, how did those clothes make you feel during that time, or like what you're going through now? So those small changes, much like you said, definitely come all together to living boldly. So I loved your example because of that. Like it went from one range to another, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, 100%. It's, I think that it can feel like a lot of pressure. And that's one of the things that I tried to make clear in the book, is that like when I talk about living boldly, or I talk about learning lessons from Frida, I'm not saying like you have to live your life exactly like Frida, or that living boldly means like, just like quitting your job and traveling the world. Like it's like it doesn't always have to be that dramatic. It could just be the little things, like you said, of just filling your life with things that make you happy and that will bring a smile to your face.
From coloring your nails or your hair as well, to like little things, or wearing those earrings every day because you love them, like no one's going to see you, but you love wearing them. Yeah, definitely. Oh my God. I know we're basically wrapping up, and I have a few more interesting questions I definitely want to touch with you. One that we can be as brief as possible because I know we have to wrap up soon. Representation matters, of course. So, you're in the media. Do you see a change within the past year, or do you think that we're just starting to show up and being seen?
I mean, I do think that there definitely has been, I do think that there's been a change. I do think that it's been a change for the better. Meaning, I think that a lot of media organizations and platforms finally woke up and realized, after the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, and then even this past month with the past 2 months, I should say, with what happened with the AAPI community. And I think therefore, like all kind of groups that are other, including Latinos, there's been, I think, a lot more attention paid. um Sorry, my puppy was like squeaking its toy. Like,
That's what I thought. I'm like, that just sounds like a squeaky toy in the
yeah.
background.
Um, but yeah, so I definitely think. Hold on one second, Leo, come here. Leo, come here. Come here. Come here.
It's like, give me the toy first.
For 10 more minutes, and then you can play with your toy.
Exactly.
He's like, Mom, you're not paying me attention.
Exactly. It's like you're right there. You're just
Uh,
staring at the screen the whole time. Look how cute I am, because your dog is ridiculous. Like I want one of your, like, the breed. I'm thinking of that breed now, which I usually love big dogs like
yeah,
Dalmatians. My husband wants a Cujo, which is a Saint Bernard, which is incredibly big.
yeah.
But I saw your dog, and I don't think it's that breed precisely, but the Cavapoo. We're just totally off topic talking about dog breeds, but they're so adorable.
Yeah, Cavapoos are so that I mean he's a sweet dog and he's very playful and very friendly. So if you do want a small dog that's also just like super playful and friendly and just like affectionate, they're a good dog. But anyway, okay. Um back to yeah, so I do think representation is getting better, but I just am wary to even say that because I think that a lot of outlets in a lot of places still have a lot of work to do, and I think that a lot of what we're seeing now a year later is that there were a lot of either publications or Instagram influencers or Instagram accounts or companies even that were making these commitments by posting the black box or just posting Black Lives Matter or like posting about their commitment to the Latinx community or the Black community or the AAPI community. But it's like those acts are just performative and we need to see real action. And I think that there is definitely a lot more attention being paid. And I think we're seeing more representation, but are any of these organizations or people actually backing up what they're saying with like real action and really making sure that this is not just like a trend and this is not just something that happened in response to some tragic killings that happened in this country. I think that kind of remains to be seen, and I think that that's something that as a journalist myself, and now being in someone, I have a team of 10 people, and when I was hiring my team, the digital team for Oprah Magazine, it was a priority of mine. I was like, my team needs to be diverse. Like, I'm not going to just go with whatever applications I get from HR because the reality is in media, like most industries, it's very insular. It's very about who you know, and the people who can afford to move to New York City and work in a magazine on like not very much money are a privileged group and most likely not the most diverse. And so, in order for us to diversify this industry, it is going to take work, and it is going to take someone probably like me who is Black or brown who is going to make it a conscious effort. But it can't just be people like me who are thinking about that. It has to be everyone. So, after last year, I suddenly got a lot of colleagues from other Hearst titles that were like, do you have any advice for hiring a diverse team or like, trying to do more diverse content for their publications? And, it's great to see the effort. But again, I don't want it to just be like, okay, it's something that we're just doing now because we want to meet quotas or we want to just like, make sure that because this has been a news story, that it's something that we are aware of. I just hope that it's actually movement that's here for good and that isn't just for as a trend.
Yes, to all of that and then some. My gosh. A
Yeah.
quick side question with this one. Do you think because the seeing the positive side of the pandemic, if we can, because we got to see the positive in everything, please. Um, do you think because now we are so used to Zoom life that because you said, for example, that it's a really small pool of people who can afford living in New York and working for these magazines. But now, because of the pandemic, a lot of people moved out of New York, and a lot of companies were like, "Well, we don't need to run an office this big because we see that our our employees are being very productive at home and they can do it." Do you think that actually helps to open the pool a little bit bigger?
I think maybe I think it remains to be seen. Like, even my company, like the conversations now with the vaccine, I think people are starting to finally just talk about what it's gonna look like when we go back to the office. And I think that people are definitely more open to having these conversations with someone who maybe isn't based in New York necessarily. But I do think that I think it's going to take some. I'm just hesitant to say like everything's going to change because I'm even already just seeing now that like it's kind of like all right, probably by Labor Day, like we'll be back in the office, and I'm a little worried that like all the things that we supposedly have learned through this pandemic are just going to immediately be forgotten. And I hope that that's not the case because to me, I'm like I don't really see why. Like as much as I love New York City, I as much as I love New York City, I don't see why we can't, be open to writers or journalists or editors who live in Texas or, the Midwest or wherever. Yeah. So, I think it's there's no reason why we can't. And I think that we've seen that, like, I mean, even like, a lot of our sites at Hearst have been the most productive that they ever or had like their best months ever during the pandemic, which just goes to show that like you can, just be just as productive and have just as great success even while we're having a team that's working remotely. So I don't really see why there's a need to. I do think that like for as a manager, I do think that like having in-person meetings and things like that are 100% beneficial. And in my dream world, I would love to see a situation where like we work like in a hybrid, but I guess we'll see.
We'll see. I love your answer though, because you're definitely in it and you're in this business and you're in there all the time. So it's definitely interesting to see that perspective where the world could go, basically, and we hope it could go. So as we wrap up, and before I tell you the three last questions I asked everybody else, one more for the hit. Because you're an avid reader, who do you recommend to read? Who are your influences that you absolutely love? You don't have to say the top five, just anyone that pops into your head, anyone Afro Latina, or any TV show, anyone in the media that you're like, hey, go follow, blah 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 blah.
Oh gosh, so many. I okay, so top of mind recently, I recently she's actually Afro Latina. She's black. She's actually Dominican. So I think she's Afro Dominican. Naima Coaster. She wrote What's Mine and Yours, which recently came out and is probably my favorite book of the year so far. It's so good. If you like narrative fiction, it's incredible. So I would definitely recommend her work. Another Afro Latina, Elizabeth Acevedo. Even if you don't love YA, I would recommend her work just because she just writes so beautifully. And even though it's more YA geared, her stories are just relatable. If you're Afro Latina, or if you've ever just been a teenager and you like know what it's like to just feel other in the world. So I love her work. I also love Angie Cruz, who wrote Dominicana, which came out, I think, 2 years ago. She's an incredible writer. Patricia Engel, who wrote Infinite Country, which came out this year. That's another book that I would definitely recommend. Who else? Who else? Who else? Gosh, there's so many. Yeah, I think those are the ones that like come to. Oh, I love the book Cantoras by Carolina de Repertis. That came out. I read it at the beginning of the pandemic, and like that book was just so transformative. And it's about a group of queer Latinx women in Uruguay in the 1970s, and like that book just like completely swept me away. I loved it so much. So
Okay, I'm definitely reading all of these. I already read Elizabeth Acevedo because I freaking adore her.
yeah, she's so
Um, but the rest I definitely, because I just love to have like that kind of diverse books without a doubt. Now,
yes.
definitely the last three, which are very easy. So, number one, to wrap it up, three adjectives to describe you.
Three adjectives. Oh gosh. I would say definitely ambitious. I'm definitely someone who I love hustling. I love working. I always like I can never really just like sit still. Like I'm always got to be working on different things. So I think that that's a word I would use. I think positive. I definitely try to always look at the bright side of things and try my best to just keep a positive energy and outlook on life. And lastly, I would say probably a homebody is something that I just embraced during this pandemic. I love just like being home with my puppy, watching Netflix, reading a good book, taking my baths. Like that's probably, I think, obviously there's been a lot of downsides the past year, but I do think one upside has been just like being in my little bubble and just embracing that. Like, that's it is what it is.
Love it. You got to soak positivity wherever you can. I mean, I'm all about that life without a doubt.
Right, right.
What are you thankful for?
Thankful for so many things. I think the number one would have to be my health. I think that obviously, again, just with so much happening this past year, I'm just so much more grateful and thankful for my health and the health of my family and my friends, and that knock on wood that we've managed to make it through this and now are vaccinated. And I actually hugged my mom for the first time this past weekend on Mother's Day. She was very, very paranoid about the pandemic, and so even though we had seen each other, we stayed like socially distanced. And this is now that our whole family's vaccinated. She came to visit for Mother's Day, and we had our first hug in like a year, and that was really nice. So I would say thankful for hugs with my mama and the vaccine.
Hugs are coming back, thankfully. Oh, I missed hugs.
Yes.
And last and definitely not least, my love, you can tell we both have very busy schedules. Where can we find you, darling?
I am on social media. So on Instagram, that's where I'm most active. You can find me at Arianna Gab. That's AriannaGab. And I'm
There's
on
Leo as well.
and there's Leo. He will find him there as well. And I'm on Twitter at Arianna G Davis. And I'm also on TikTok. I'm like trying to like get into the TikTok world, but mostly I just follow other people. So if you want the good stuff, find me on Instagram, and you can find my book, What Would Frida Do, wherever you buy your books, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, bookshop.org. And there's also the audiobook is also on Libro FM and Audible.
Perfect. Thank you so much for, grabbing a little bit of your time with us. Definitely, I love talking to you every single time. Huge supporter of what you do and your message. My door's always open for absolutely everything and anything because that's what we're here to do, to support people that are so amazing and talented as you and are giving a voice to people who really need it so we can be finally seen. I'm gonna like not cry. I'll probably cry after the episode because it's so nice and refreshing to see. And Leo as well. He's like barking. He's like, "Hey, I'm here too." And I'm like, "Guess who are, Leo?"
He's like, don't forget about me. Thank you so much for everything that you do for the community and for all of your support. And to thank you to everyone who was listening.
Thank you very much. As for us, we'll see you next week, my loves. Have a beautiful day, evening, whenever it is that you're listening to this. Talk to y'all soon. Bye, Team Flyer.
Bye.